This is Michael Osterlink. Welcome to O Radio, where we explore individual and social transformation through collaborative action. I'm a psychotherapist with a transpersonal and somatic specialization. I'm also a transpartisan social entrepreneur, head instructor at Silfit's Unbeatable Mind Academy, executive coach at Spartan 7, and director of human resilience at Aperion Zoe. Today's show is brought to you by Somatic Psychotherapy Today, an online resource for all topics related to body-oriented psychology. Today's guest is Jan Winhall. Jan is a psychotherapist in private practice and director of Focusing on Borden, a center for teaching focusing and focus-oriented therapy. Jan is the author of Understanding and Treating Addiction with the Felt Sense Experience Model and An Emerging Practice in Focus-Oriented Psychotherapy, Innovative Theory and Applications. Jan teaches internationally and is a lecturer in the Faculty of Social Work at the University of Toronto. She is currently writing a book about her felt sense polyvagal model for treating addiction. Hi, Jan.
Hi, Michael.
Good to see you.
You too.
So, how did you discover the body for yourself that eventually led you in academic study to utilize it as the focus of your therapeutic work?
So this goes back to, shockingly, 40 years ago. I've been doing this work for a long time now. And I started in working with a group of young women who were incest survivors. And imagine, here I am, fresh out of school, graduate school. For some reason, I knew how to listen without bringing a lot of layers of theory or diagnoses or any of that, any content. I really just knew that I needed to be with these women and listen to what their stories were, what their experience was. And as I did that, I learned more and more about what was happening for them physically in their bodies. And I realized that as they were talking about all of these behaviors that they were engaged in that seemed really bizarre and really troublesome at the time, like ones that we're more familiar with, like drinking a lot or doing a lot of drugs, but also lots of compulsive sexual acting out, lots of cutting their bodies, chewing on bars of soap, just things that some of them really puzzled me. And of course they were deeply disturbing. But as I listened to what they were describing and followed through with their experience, I saw in their bodies and I heard them talk about a kind of physical release or a relief that this behavior brought.
Okay.
And I could see it when they would kind of go into it and in the group session and talk about it. I could see what in focusing we call the felt shift in their bodies. And it's a physiological shift. So eventually, years later, when I discovered polyvagal theory, I realized, this is a shift in the autonomic nervous system. Mm-hmm. But I didn't know that at the time. I just knew that I needed to pay attention to the body because this was where all the trauma was living.
Now, you talked about you being able to listen deeply without judgment, without all the academic theories on top of the diagnostic and statistical manual and all that stuff. That's actually a rare skill, even among therapists.
I know.
Did you have, is that something you developed or cultivated growing up? As a
I don't know.
young girl?
I grew up with a pretty questioning and intelligent mother.
Okay.
Who was in the business to some extent herself. Okay. And I think that was part of it. I mean, she had her issues for sure, but there were gifts that she gave me, and maybe that was one of them in a way. And then I just felt it in my own body. So, and I was very critical already of the current psychiatric system because I could see the way in which it was really misogynistic. And my
It's
mother was a
still,
staunch feminist, so definitely that was part of how I got to that. But it was also very disrespectful to men too, who were particularly falling under this diagnosis of borderline personality disorder, which we still see now as um, can be often very problematic and very judgmental, the way that people approach it, right? But back then it was really bad. like just shockingly bad. And so here I was in this kind of, in a psychiatric, I was working in a general hospital, but in the psychiatric ward.
okay.
And all these young women who'd been sexually assaulted by their fathers or stepfathers were now becoming psychiatric patients on medication with diagnoses. And in my mind, they were victims of violence, sexual violence. And also the attitude was just really, because people didn't understand the addictive, the behaviors, these behaviors that became addictive because they worked.
Yeah.
They brought relief into the body because the body didn't know any other way of bringing relief, because there was no safe place.
Before we get into your training in the felt sense, then your studying of the polyvagal model, so you talked about perhaps where your active listening skills came from, your
Mm-hmm.
inquisitive, your query from your, not that you had to come from your mom, but she was a
Some
good
of
role
it did.
model. Some of it
Yeah,
sounds
yeah.
good, but even with that, um, active listening with the ears is a lot different than active listening with your whole body.
Yes.
So was it an intuitive thing when you're sitting there that you just felt that there was something going on the other side of their body that you could feel through yours? So it wasn't
Yeah.
just hearing, but it's
Yeah.
feeling
It
deeply?
was feeling deeply, which I've always been drawn um, to deep experiencing. I've, I don't know. I mean, who knows what that's all about?
Well,
But it's, thank goodness, I never lost that.
that's
And
good. Yeah.
yeah, and well, it's really the kernel of what my work is about and what I really want to get out there in terms of addiction.
One more question. When you're working with these young ladies in the
Mhm.
psychiatric ward, did you find yourself when you like went home for the night or you finished your shift?
Mhm.
How did you deal with your own, if this was in fact a problem or a challenge for you, the energy that you kind of perhaps took in
Yeah.
from your work with these ladies?
Mhm.
How did you
Yeah,
discharge that or deal with that?
that part of it I didn't know so much how to deal. And back
Yeah.
then we didn't even talk about it. There was
Yeah.
no talk about compassion fatigue or, secondary trauma. We were
Right.
on our own. And I definitely got traumatized, vicariously traumatized, no question about that. It was really tough. I did we started a feminist therapist group in Toronto, and that helped a lot, even though in the beginning we didn't really talk about that part of it a lot. But as we stayed with the work more and got to trust each other more, and also just became more and more traumatized,
Mhm.
it spilled out, and that was definitely helpful. The feminist community in the 80s was wonderful for that. I mean, we had Judith Herman, we had amazing people. um, Judith Herman, trauma and recovery, just a brilliant woman.
Yeah.
um, and Chris Courtois, lots of people that were doing the work and really were very, very strong mentors for us then.
That's excellent. Good. Good
Yeah,
for you, because
yeah.
that's a very difficult energy to sit with if you don't have
Oh,
support.
yeah.
Yeah. So, all right. So you sounds like you kind of you've cultivated the ability to be with people through deep listening and through the body and in kind of an intuitive way of being with people. But then it was kind of that way of being was channeled through a training. How
Yes.
did you discover felt sense and that whole system?
Well, that was wonderful, because back then in the 80s, again, it was just, there was so much happening, and we had these amazing conferences. And I started working with several people who would be now diagnosed as having dissociative identity disorder.
Mm.
Don't like the word. I call it an adaptation.
Yep.
Um, and it was really over the top. It's like, whoa, what am I doing here? but very, of course, very intrigued. And so when I went to one of these conferences, they said, "Oh, there's this wonderful focusing-oriented therapist, Mary Armstrong, and she's doing trainings in working with people with multiplicity." So I signed up, and another woman too, Margot Rivera, was doing the work. So we had a community. We had a strong community of women who were supporting women. And at that time too, of course, people very seldom talked about boys or men being sexually abused. That was 40 years ago, forget it. Right. Now we're much more sophisticated, and so I signed up with Mary, and I learned all about how to even deepen this process of listening into the body, into what we call the felt sense. And that was like giving me like a motor to just, really keep going into this and develop it more and more. This is the work of Jean Gendlin.
So how did that work affect you personally? Not as a therapist, because obviously it's affected you as a therapist in a really positive way to work with your clients.
Yeah.
But how did it help you in any way, maybe transform the way you were with yourself?
With myself? Well, I entered psychotherapy with Mary.
Okay.
And so that's really how I learned the process, was to do my own work. And I talk about that in the book, how the first day I ever went to see her, and I was so overwhelmed with vicarious trauma. And I just started crying. And she said, "Oh, your tears are welcomed here." And the way that she said it, it was like right from the beginning, she paid attention to the process, not the content. And she just made this big space to welcome whatever came into it. She was remarkable at making this kind of space that was so undefined and yet so comforting and safe at the same time. There's a paradox. Yeah. And
that's
so
awesome.
I worked through my own journey there of understanding myself and what was getting triggered, and how to work with triggers inside myself in a focusing way. And then I just got so keen about it. I did the training with her.
For our viewing and listening audience who might not know about Gendler's work and focusing, can you just do like a minute primer on it?
Sure, yeah. So Jean Gendlin was the fellow who actually coined the term felt sense. And now we're hearing it more and more in the last couple of years, all of the somatic therapists and whatever talking about felt sense. Peter Levine knew Jean, and when Peter Levine started talking about felt sense and somatic experiencing, I think more and more people have begun to have a sense of what it is. Although I also think people don't totally know what it is. So yes, I welcome being able to talk to it. So what Gendlin discovered was what he called initially the direct referent. So when people if I'm here with you, Michael, and I start to pay attention to what's happening inside my body, and I notice that I've got a kind of tightness, a little bit of tightness in my upper chest, some tingling around my arms and legs, because, well, I'm a little bit up in that sympathetic because I'm excited and I'm enjoying being with you and sharing this stuff. So then if that's just the sensations, that's not a felt sense. A felt sense would be that if I go inside and I start to get curious about this whole situation, the feelings that I have. So I talk about kind of avenues into exploring a felt sense, the feelings, the thoughts, the physical sensations in the body. And then also I've really particularly added memory. Because when you work with trauma, you're working with memory, which is not just from the past, it's in the body now, right? So we would go into that in the body. And as you stay with that, if you're accompanied by somebody that is doing what you're doing right now, which is really, I feel like you're really being with me. You're really being with me. I don't feel any, kind of agenda. You're here right with me. As we stay with all of that, and really get curious about it, more of it starts to come. And as it comes and builds, it kind of becomes more and more intricate. And as you spend more time with it, it tells a story. And often if you have an issue, so focusing, we often pay attention to an issue in our life. So there's something in there that wants to come about this issue. And you can feel the fullness of it. And when you stay with it, and then sometimes we ask questions, we drop them down, not up here in the head, but down in the body. And then we look for this physiological shift in the body that sometimes comes, not always. But sometimes you'll get this kind of, oh, that's what's bugging me about this. That's why I feel so upset. And it's not just insight. It's an actual full-bodied understanding, physical. And what it is a neurophysiological shift in the body, often from either sympathetic or dorsal down to ventral.
Okay.
And you feel, and that's what I saw in these young women. And then when I started working with focusing and studying it and reading what Jan had written, this is exactly what he saw in the process that he then did research on, and realized that when people can do this, when they engage in this depth of experiencing, this is what produces change.
So I'm going to ask you in a moment to talk about the autonomic nervous system, a little bit greater detail in the polyvagal model. But before I do, so I just want to make sure I'm clear on what I'm hearing you say.
Yeah.
A lot of psychotherapeutic models start with the why. Once you know your story, you have an insight, and allegedly that changes things. Most of the times it doesn't, but that's kind of the theory. What I hear you saying is that there's a complex how, like all these different variables that you're exploring through kind of an inquiry process of how your whole embodied cognition, like how you embody whatever the story then emerges from that, as opposed to having a story which you explore.
Right.
Is that something along those lines?
Yes, it's like you can talk about it in different, you can talk about it in terms of top down. So in the top down model, a traditional kind of scientific model that most psychotherapies are based on, right? It's about content and dividing things up into little, boxes or units or diagnostic categories, and getting the content and having the client have insight, or different theories will have different explanations. Yeah. But none of them actually really talk about what makes the change.
Yeah.
And this is what I've just been reading, Gendlin, because I'm writing about him. Right. And he has this beautiful paper, The Theories of Personality Change. And he says, we can talk about repression and things they come to us and we understand them. But what really creates the change, and what he's saying, is it comes from bottom up. It comes from this bodily felt sense of aliveness and the shift that comes. So we can also talk about it in terms of, post Descartes, after, so when we fell deeply into this really cognitively based, real split, with the mind body, and it's damaged us so badly, so deeply and badly. What's really exciting though, is that we're seeing more and more now, what the experiential psychotherapists, Carl Rogers and Gendlin, were talking about back in the 50s and the 60s.
Right.
Yeah. And that's really exciting and very, very hopeful.
Well, it's very exciting, and not that we have to get into critique of culture, but you talked about kind of the patriarchal, psychiatric, and I'd add medical model that we've been dealing with for a long, long time.
Yeah.
And Descartes is kind of like the father of that kind of worldview, and that your time in the 80s with kind of the feminist movement kind of challenged that model, and this is kind of a continuation. And we don't have to necessarily put it in a feminist category, but this is a continuation of that challenge to the mind-body split, that we are embodied beings.
Yes.
And when you make that split, you have a whole host of problems, including all those poor women 40 years ago who are polypharmacies, psychiatrically diagnosed, and all that kind of good stuff. I'll say all this
Yeah.
kind of good stuff, all
Yeah.
the kind of bad stuff.
Yeah.
With all the what you're talking about, do you see, obviously with your clients and the people that you train with, shifts are happening, but do you see changing in the psychology or in psychiatric systems themselves in the institutions, or are they just kind of lagging way behind?
I think essentially no.
Yeah.
There may be little pockets where
Yeah.
people, I don't want to, just rag on people in those
Yeah.
institutions. They're working hard. They're mostly really good people and all that.
Mhm.
But I'm always, I mean, for example, now the government's just given all this money for therapy for mental health for people because of COVID,
COVID.
and
Yeah.
all the money's going to CBT.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I'm not saying I think CBT is horrible, but I think CBT in connection with a real embodiment, like using some of those CBT skills, but we have to go into the body.
Yeah.
That's where it lives. We live in our bodies. We are not machines.
Right. Very true. So let me go back and ask you the question about the autonomic nervous system and the polyvagal theory, and then I
Mm-hmm.
do want to talk about your addiction
Yeah.
model. You talked about parasympathetic sympathetic activation. Can you talk a
Yeah.
little bit more about, and we can use the ladies from 40 years ago who you saw as clients, maybe use them as the reference point of what you saw in their autonomic nervous system, referring back to them. Maybe you didn't know it at the time.
Yes.
You had an intuitive hit this was going on, but now you can explain it. Can
Well,
you explain what you saw?
yeah, I understood it. I think, most of us understand flight, fight, freeze.
Hmm.
And we had that language back then too. And I could see that I could see that they were either going into this kind of flight, fight place where the body would tense up a lot, either through fear or anger, or sometimes a bit of both. And then I could also see where they were dropping down into a dissociated state. And, we didn't talk about the dorsal vagus then. And I mean, some people still don't talk about the dorsal vagus, but we did talk about a dissociation and trance states. And you could see that too, because the body would the shape of the body would fold in,
Yep.
And there was a lot of that would go on in the room where people were either clenched up or folded in like that. And then as we developed this incredible kind of emotional intimacy and safety in the moment anyway. They weren't safe otherwise, but we did develop moments of safety together, and people really revealed incredible stories that were horrendous. But you could see, and this is something Jenlyn points out a lot, and you can see this when you work with the body like this, right? Where even when these horrific things are being referenced and paid attention to, when that happens and they're horrific, even it doesn't matter how horrible or painful they are, the body releases and people feel better because we paid attention. And Jenlyn would say, oh, it likes it when I come there.
And it's really interesting too, because you mentioned before, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but these women's reactions to their trauma was not pathological, as an adaptation. They were trying to get to the same, if I hear you correctly, to a homeostasis state.
Yeah, they were, I thought they were incredibly inventive.
Yeah.
And we all did as feminist therapists. We thought they were heroes. And there's a resurgence of that now with polyvagal theory, that understanding that these ways are adaptive.
Yeah.
And they need to really be honored. We used to call it honoring the guard dogs.
Mm.
So it's not new. It's just that, what polyvagal theory has given us is another way of understanding this, how adaptive these ways are of surviving. And of course, it's given us lots of more wonderful things too. But that main message isn't new.
Before we get into your 6 F's,
Yeah.
which I think is amazing. One last question. When you talked about some of the women were, in a hyper reactive, sympathetic
Yeah.
state. Others were collapsed and kind of
Yeah.
disassociative. Did you ever find some were a mixture of the two?
Yes. And that's something that I think we're all kind of being really curious about
Yeah.
now, right? And that people we didn't, I don't know that we really talked about that 40 years ago in that group. We we had a way of talking about it, but now people are really, I think because I spell it out so clearly on my model,
Yeah.
that they'll say to me, but can't you be in both of those places at the same time? And that's where the beauty of taking something, that Steve has created. And then as therapists, because he's not a therapist, we're working with it. We're seeing, how do you really bring this model to life? And it will change over time, I'm sure, in some ways. And it already has, because now we have these intertwining states or blended states. And so, yeah, and Peter Levine also talked about that. The ways in which you can be in sympathetic and parasympathetic at the same time. So you've kind of got your foot on the brake and the gas.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Wow.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's jump into your model,
Mm-hmm.
your 6F model.
That's the client version.
Okay.
So I made two versions. One is a clinician version, which is a lot what people would look at it, and while it's kind of pretty, they get a bit scared.
Okay.
So I made a simple one. Yeah.
Well, we can do the clinician version, since most people who be watching this will be in the clinician space.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So, and we'll also include a link so people can actually see what you're talking about.
Yes. Yeah, that would be great.
Okay. But so addicted, rigidity, chaos, play, integrated, stillness.
Right.
Break those down.
Okay. Well, they correspond with the client version of the 6Fs.
Mm-hmm.
So if I break it down with the clinician version, the integrated state is the ventral vagus. Okay. And this part of what happened in building the model is that over the years, after I really got into focusing oriented therapy, and trauma therapy and feminist therapy, and then this wave of interpersonal neurobiology with Siegel's work, and beautiful Bonnie Badenoch, and just wonderful work. And so that is another layer of the model that came. And then after that, I really discovered polyvagal theory. So that's why I use quite a bit of the language of both in the clinician model. So chaos and rigidity. So chaos is the sympathetic branch of the nervous system that Siegel talks about in terms of chaos. And then rigidity is the dorsal branch of the nervous system, the parasympathetic. So we've got the ventral down at the bottom of the model, and then up into sympathetic, over into dorsal. And then what I realized when I went to, I had this model already, flight, fight, freeze, and I added, for ventral, I called it flock, because of the social engagement system. Mm-mm. We flock together, and people like that. It made sense to them. And then so I had that model already. And then I went to Deb Dana's, a 2-day course on polyvagal theory, which was great. And I realized in looking at all this that the place I was calling addicted, at the top of the model, in between the sympathetic and the dorsal, was really an intertwining state. That Porges talks about play and stillness as intertwining states. You follow me?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so I realized, so if those are intertwining, say play is intertwining between the ventral vagus and sympathetic, then I think what I'm saying is that the addiction serves as a kind of propeller, and an intertwining propels the client from either chaos to rigidity, or rigidity to chaos. And people will tell you that they use certain things for different reasons, either because they feel too dead, so they've got to come alive, so they would maybe get into some kind of a stimulant or something pumps adrenaline a lot, or they feel too intensely sympathetic and they're looking to conk out. And so for me then, addiction is really about ways that we develop to manage our autonomic nervous system when we can't go down to a state of ventral.
It just struck me. I just had an image. You just described it at a different scale. Almost every American, or North American, maybe, I don't know, but the Canadians,
Yeah.
we drink our caffeine in the morning.
Yeah.
And we have alcohol at night. I mean, and I'm not talking about like addiction at that extreme quality, extreme scale, but it's just the scale is different.
Yeah, exactly.
It's interesting.
Exactly. Yeah. And the line between, I mean, we all have to learn how to emotionally regulate, right?
Mm-hmm.
Between flooding and numbing is what we used to call it, flooding and numbing. I mean, really good words for enlivening something, right? In fact, they're in some ways better words than chaos and rigidity, I think. But I wanted in the clinician model, I wanted to really, use our theories. So match the language with the theory, so that we can, I mean, that's what a model is, right? You layer these different theories and then we work with them and we dispel them and we say they're wrong and they're right and all of that. we play with them.
Play. Well, it's in your chart too.
Yeah.
But so let me ask you this. If the vision is between if you're dead and you want to alive yourself, or you're too alive and you want to deaden yourself. If we look eastward towards meditation and yogic systems, as an example, there are a lot of really interesting body-based practices which teach us how to do that self-regulatory way. So you don't have to use exogenous chemicals. Yeah,
well, focusing is one of those practices.
So plug in focusing, how this works with this.
So on the clinician model, focusing and a meditation practice or whatever would be in what Steve calls stillness. Okay. So it's a combination, a blending of ventral, because you feel the body feels, grounded, and also dorsal, because you feel safe enough to be immobilized.
Yep.
Yeah. And in the clinician, the client model, I call it flow.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Excellent. But then talk about the other side, when you want to activate yourself.
Yeah. So play.
Yeah.
Or in the F's model, I call it fun.
Yes.
Play is, what I always think about with that one is when you hear kids outside.
Yeah.
Or you're with your kids outside and you can hear them playing and you can hear that they feel fun and it's safe and they're laughing and everything. And then there's this moment where you hear the shift and all of a sudden somebody bursts into tears, right? And that's the shift that goes into sympathetic. That somebody's gotten hurt and either they're angry and they're going to fight, or they're going to get the hell out of there.
Right.
And it's so interesting how our nervous systems as parents we're so cued to that. Like you can hear a good parent will say, careful, like when they know, you can just feel that somebody's going to get hurt.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
But they don't stop anyway.
They're kids. They're not supposed to.
Yeah, that's true.
So walk us through, if you had a client come in and they have an addiction, we can narcotics or alcohol, whatever one you want to use.
Or let's talk a lot about behavioral addictions.
Pick one.
I mean, those are huge, right?
Okay.
Do a lot of work with sex addiction.
Okay.
But it can be anything that helps you in the short term. It hurts you in the long term, and you cannot stop doing it.
So walk us through. You pick a client. Pick whatever kind of addiction that they have, and then walk us through how you use the model with them.
So this would be an interesting one, say with sex addiction.
Okay.
Where there's a whole kind of piece in the addictive behavior that's very trauma laden. So somebody who is acting out sexually and feels an incredible sense of up into sympathetic, an incredible sense of fear that they're going to get caught, and shame. And so we work with, first of all, just getting a sense of what's going on inside in the body around that. So working at first, of course, with trying to make a connection with the person and help to establish some sense of I'm here with you.
Good. Okay.
And I do understand some of what's happening for you. And I don't judge what is happening with you.
Okay.
And we together are going to be really curious about what's frightening you so much.
Okay, good, good.
Then we do just lots of grounding if I can in the beginning, because it's, sometimes you're just right in it, before, and then you got to back up. And with focusing, we have lots of ways of working with similar, I think, we all do these things in different ways of getting the right closeness and distance from the intensity. So teaching at first, to come back from the intensity of it, feet on the floor, making contact, using co-regulation that we would say, for example, in polyvagal theory, right? So safety, say as much as we can, because the world is an unsafe place. And then a lot of connecting in a little bit, because with addiction, of course, what you're trying to do is get away from your body. Yeah. So it's fine for me, to start talking about how wonderful it is to feel things. I don't do that in the beginning, that's for sure, because no, it's not wonderful. It's horrible to feel things. But slowly, and we're talking years, slowly begin to realize and work your way around the model so that people start to see that what first comes before this acting out behavior, what first comes, and noticing what that is in the body slowly over time.
Let me ask you about that, because at one point, and it probably still does occur, but kind of within the post-Reichian or, body-oriented therapy world, there is a group of people who really like to supercharge their clients and get them really active,
Yeah.
Well, probably a lot less now than there was 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah.
But from what I hear you saying is that lessons are learned that the client cannot handle that.
Well, no. And in fact,
that's why you go so slowly.
Yes, very, very slow. And Jen talks about that a lot in terms of dead ends. So 2 dead ends in the process of therapy. One is flooding. It's a dead end. Yep. And the other is numbing. It's a dead end. Okay. So we're always working with emotional regulation. Okay. And I found that just making a space where a person who's acting out in a way that they feel so shamed, making a space where, you just ask the questions so they feel they can tell you because you're ready to hear them. Right. And that in and of itself is huge. Yeah. It's huge. And then, we can start working with what they want to do in terms of harm reduction or whatever. And that has to also come from the body. Yep. When you're ready, how's that going to be? How do we pace it? But very titrated. Yeah. Excellent.
Well, so when will we expect your book to come out?
Well,
so you can read more about this.
Yeah. The manuscript's due November 1.
Okay.
So I'm heavily through, but still got a ways to go.
Now, if people want to read your other 2 books or work with you as a therapist, how would they go about finding your work and finding you to work with you?
Sure. I don't have 2 books. I have a chapter in one book.
I apologize.
How they go is to my website, which is focusingonboredom@gmail.com. I have a community, so I'm me, and I'm also my community of trainers.
Oh, excellent. Okay, good.
Yeah, we work in community.
Well, I'm not surprised.
Yeah.
Well, I'll make sure to include all that information in the show notes, links to the book and links to your community as well.
Super.
Excellent. And I look forward to reading your book when it comes out.
Thank you so much, Michael. Yeah. It's been really enjoyable.
Very nice to talk to you, Jan.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. Bye-bye.
Be safe.